Think about this for a second. Right now, every time you pull into a gas station, a chunk of what you pay disappears into a tax that's supposedly there to keep the roads under your wheels in decent shape. It feels like the most natural arrangement in the world. You burn fuel, you wear down the pavement, you pay a little tax on that fuel, the tax fixes the pavement. Clean, logical, almost self-evident. Surely you'd assume this is how America has always paid for its roads. Except it isn't. Not even close. The federal gasoline tax, the one most people assume has quietly funded the nation's highways since the dawn of the automobile, didn't exist until 1932. 1932. That's not the early days of the car. That's roughly a quarter century after the Model T rolled off Henry Ford's assembly line, deep into the Great Depression, with tens of millions of automobiles already jamming American roads. For decades, cars puttered along, farmers hauled their crops, families set off on the nation's first road trips, and not 1 cent of federal gas tax existed to pay for any of it. So here's the real question, the one most people never stop to ask. If the gas tax wasn't paying for roads for the first several decades of the automotive age, who was? Where did the money come from? And when you actually dig into the answer, you find something far stranger and more revealing than a simple story about taxes. You find a story about farmers forced to sweat their taxes into the dirt with a shovel, about a private company charging tolls on the very first road that led out of Philadelphia, about a bizarre alliance of wealthy bicycle enthusiasts who, decades before most Americans had ever seen an automobile, built the entire political machine that would eventually pave the nation. And you find out that when the federal gas tax finally did arrive, it wasn't even created to fund roads at all. It was created for a completely different reason, one that would probably surprise you. So let's follow the money, literally, from the muddy village lanes of colonial America all the way to that overlooked afternoon in 1932, and figure out how in the world this country ever built a road network at all before it figured out the obvious way to pay for one. Let's go back to the very beginning, because the earliest answer to how were roads paid for is honestly one of the most uncomfortable facts in this entire story. In colonial America, and for the first century or so of the United States, the primary way most rural roads got built and maintained wasn't through any tax paid in coin at all. It was through your body. This system had a name, statute labor, sometimes called the road tax or the labor tax. And it worked exactly like it sounds. Local governments, mostly townships and counties, would legally require able-bodied men in the community to show up and work on the roads for a set number of days each year, usually somewhere between 2 and 6 days, grading the dirt, filling ruts, clearing brush, hauling stone. If you didn't want to swing a shovel yourself, most jurisdictions let you pay a fee instead, essentially buying your way out of the labor obligation, with New York, for example, assessing a minimum of 3 days of road work or a payment of about 62.5 cents a day to avoid it. But if you were a farmer without spare cash, and most people were, you paid your road tax the hard way with sweat. Think about what this actually meant for the quality of American roads. The people doing the work weren't professional road builders. They were farmers, and their attention followed the farming calendar, not the actual condition of the road. Historians who've studied this system note something almost darkly comic about it, that the schedule for road repair was dictated by when crops needed tending, not by when the road had actually fallen apart. There was no dedicated foreman with real authority, no continuity of labor, no incentive structure that rewarded quality work, because nobody involved had any financial stake in whether the road turned out well or terribly. It was, in the driest sense, a tax paid in mediocrity. And layered on top of the labor requirement, colonial and early American governments also leaned on property taxes, and in some states, a straightforward poll tax, a flat annual charge per person that could likewise be paid either in cash or in labor, dedicated toward road upkeep. This was the baseline reality of American road funding for roughly the first 2 centuries of European settlement, and it produced exactly the kind of roads you'd expect. Rutted, muddy in spring, choked with dust in summer, often little more than the boundary lines between farms, laid out not for efficient travel, but because that's where nobody happened to be growing crops. But by the late 1700s, something new started to emerge, driven by a very different logic. Private enterprise smelled an opportunity. In 1792, a group of investors in Pennsylvania chartered a company to build a genuinely improved road connecting Philadelphia and Lancaster, and completed it 2 years later. This was the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike, and it's widely considered the first great turnpike company in American history. And I want you to notice the word company, because this wasn't a government project. This was private capital, betting that people would pay real money out of pocket for the privilege of traveling on a smoother, better maintained road, one built with a layer of crushed stone, an engineering technique that was genuinely advanced for its time. The company would collect its return through toll gates positioned along the route, charging travelers by the mile or by the type of vehicle and livestock they brought through. It worked at least well enough to trigger a genuine boom. Over the following decades, turnpike companies multiplied across the country at a staggering pace. More than 50 were chartered in Connecticut alone, 67 in New York, dozens more across Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and beyond. This wasn't a minor sideshow to America's economic development. At its peak, private investment in these toll roads represented a genuinely enormous share of the young nation's economy, connecting farms to markets, ports to inland towns, and turning what had been days of miserable travel into merely difficult travel. And the federal government even got involved directly for a stretch. In 1806, Congress authorized funding for what became known as the Cumberland Road, or the National Road, a genuinely ambitious federally sponsored highway stretching from Maryland westward through Pennsylvania, over the Cumberland Mountains, toward the Ohio River. For a period, it stood as proof that the new republic could build major infrastructure when it decided the cause was important enough. But here's the thing about the Turnpike era that the popular imagination tends to romanticize away. It didn't actually last, and it didn't actually work all that well as a permanent solution. By the 1830s and 1840s, most turnpike companies were struggling. Canals came along and pulled freight traffic away. Then railroads arrived and delivered an even more devastating blow, offering faster, cheaper transport that toll roads simply couldn't compete with. One by one, the private turnpike companies collapsed, defaulted, or simply abandoned their charters, handing the roads back to overwhelmed local governments that usually lacked the money to maintain them properly. Many of these once proud toll roads reverted to free public use and quickly degenerated back into exactly what they'd been built to replace: miles of dust, mud, and wheel ruts. So by the second half of the 19th century, America found itself back roughly where it started. Most rural roads, and there were millions of miles of them, were funded through that same old patchwork of property taxes, poll taxes, and statute labor. As late as 1904, when the federal government finally conducted a serious national survey of road financing, only 25 states even permitted counties or townships to issue bonds for road improvement. And where that privilege existed, it was used sparingly, usually reserved for something genuinely expensive like a steel bridge. 11 states were still collecting an annual poll tax specifically dedicated to road upkeep, payable, again, in either cash or labor. This is worth sitting with for a moment. On the eve of the automobile age, the primary system for funding American roads was barely more sophisticated than it had been under the colonial governors more than a century earlier. And then, in one of the more delightful ironies of American history, the entire system got shaken loose not by the automobile at all, but by the bicycle. In May of 1880, a group of cycling enthusiasts gathered in the seaside resort town of Newport, Rhode Island, and formed an organization called the League of American Wheelmen. Understand who these people were, because it matters enormously to the story. Bicycles in this era, particularly the towering, dangerous high-wheel penny-farthing-style machines, were not a working-class mode of transportation. They cost several times a tradesman's weekly wage. Riding one required real athleticism, real nerve, and crucially, real leisure time. The League of American Wheelmen was, in other words, an organization of the wealthy, urban, and well-connected, and its membership eventually swelled past 100,000. These well-heeled cyclists had a very specific grievance. Outside of cities, American roads remained the same dirt and gravel disaster they'd always been, and a rutted country lane was miserable and often dangerous to navigate on too thin wheels. So the League of American Wheelmen did something that would prove enormously consequential. They organized and they lobbied, and they built one of the first truly sophisticated political advocacy campaigns in American history around a single cause: better roads. This campaign came to be known as the Good Roads Movement, and it was substantially bankrolled and personally championed by a bicycle manufacturing magnate named Albert Pope, who used his own fortune to fund a magazine called Good Roads, which within just 3 years of launching in 1892 had reached a circulation of roughly 1 million readers. Now, to actually win, the wealthy wheelmen needed allies beyond their own social class, and they found a clever one. They turned to American farmers. The League's leadership made the case again and again in speeches and pamphlets that bad roads were a hidden tax on rural life, arguing that the mud and ruts of the era's roads forced farmers to own and feed as many as 2 million more horses nationally than they'd actually need if the roads were simply smoother, since deteriorated roads dramatically increased the physical strain of hauling anything by wagon. It's a genuinely clever argument, connecting an elite recreational grievance to a very real economic burden felt by ordinary rural Americans, and it worked. Farmers' organizations and bicyclist organizations joined forces, and what had started as essentially a hobbyist complaint transformed into a genuine national political movement, and it produced results. In 1893, Congress created the Office of Road Inquiry, a small federal office with a shoestring budget of just $10,000, but a real and permanent foothold for the idea that road quality was a national concern, not just a local one. It's worth noting, as some historians have pointedly observed, that this early alliance between well-to-do urban cyclists and struggling rural farmers wasn't entirely comfortable or equal. The people pushing loudest for road improvements were often tourists imposing their preferences on the small-town Americans who actually lived along and were legally obligated to maintain those roads. But the coalition held together long enough to permanently change the national conversation. And then, right as this movement was gathering real momentum, the entire landscape shifted again, because the automobile arrived, and it arrived in overwhelming numbers. Henry Ford's Model T rolled out in 1908, and by the mid-1920s, well over 15 million of them had been produced. The bicycle lobby that had started the Good Roads movement rapidly found itself displaced by a far more powerful successor, the automobile industry itself, along with newly formed organizations like the American Automobile Association. The pressure for genuinely modern, government-funded roads became impossible for Washington to ignore any longer. That pressure finally produced federal action in 1916, when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Aid Road Act, sometimes called the Bankhead-Shackelford Act, the very first piece of federal legislation dedicated to funding road construction nationwide. It authorized $75 million in matching funds over 5 years, meaning states had to put up their own money to receive federal support, generally on a 50-50 basis. And notice something important about how this law was framed. It wasn't officially sold to Congress as a highway bill for automobiles. It was framed, tellingly, as aid for rural post roads used by the United States Mail. This was partly a clever bit of constitutional maneuvering, since federal authority over the postal system was well established and uncontroversial, while a national highway program for private automobiles felt, to many politicians of that era, uncomfortably close to federal overreach into what had always been considered strictly local and state business. So by the late 19-teens, the federal government was finally chipping in matching funds. But matching funds require the states to match them with something. And this created enormous pressure on state governments to find a genuinely new and sustainable revenue source, because the old system of property taxes and general funds simply wasn't going to be enough to keep up with the exploding demand from automobile owners for better pavement. And this is where our story finally arrives at the gas tax. And it starts somewhat fittingly given everything we've covered, on the far western edge of the country in the state of Oregon. On February 25th, 1919, the Oregon State Legislature passed a bill imposing a 1 cent per gallon tax on gasoline to be used specifically for road construction and maintenance. And here's a detail that really tells you something about how obviously sensible this idea felt once someone actually proposed it. The bill passed the Oregon House with only 4 dissenting votes, and the state Senate with only 2. It wasn't controversial, it was almost embarrassingly popular. The logic was elegant in a way that the old statute labor system never was. If you drove more, you bought more gas, and so you paid proportionally more toward the roads you were actually wearing down. It felt, for the first time in the history of American road funding, like something approaching a genuinely fair system. And once one state had proven the concept, it spread with astonishing speed. Within roughly a decade of Oregon's law, every single one of the then 48 states, along with the District of Columbia, had enacted its own version of a gasoline tax. This is one of the fastest, most complete policy adoptions in American history. A fundamental restructuring of how an entire nation funded its infrastructure, achieved almost entirely at the state level, state by state, without any coordinated national mandate forcing it to happen. By 1929, the transformation was essentially complete. So now we finally arrive at the year in our title, 1932, and here's where the story delivers its final, genuinely surprising twist. Because if you assumed that the federal gas tax, when it finally showed up, was created to fund federal highways, you would be wrong, completely wrong. By 1932, the United States was 3 brutal years into the Great Depression, and the federal government's finances were in absolute freefall. Tax revenues had collapsed as incomes and corporate profits evaporated, while the deficit ballooned to levels the country had never experienced in peacetime. President Herbert Hoover, desperate to shore up federal credit and reassure a terrified public and financial markets that Washington could still balance its books, pushed through a sweeping new package of tax increases known as the Revenue Act of 1932. It raised income tax rates dramatically, doubled the estate tax, increased corporate taxes, and added new levies on dozens of everyday consumer goods. Everything from chewing gum and candy to jewelry, cameras, and toiletries. And buried within that enormous list of new taxes was a 1 cent per gallon federal tax on gasoline. But listen to how this tax was actually described and understood at the time, because it directly contradicts the assumption most people carry around today. This was never proposed or intended as highway funding. It was purely a general revenue measure designed to help close the federal deficit and reassure creditors that America's finances were under control. When Hoover signed the bill into law on June 6, 1932, he explicitly framed it in terms of protecting the nation's credit, not in terms of building better roads. In fact, internal Treasury officials had actually debated whether to propose a gas tax at all. And one of the specific reasons they'd initially hesitated was the recognition that states had already claimed gasoline taxation as their own dedicated territory for highway funding, and Washington was essentially muscling into a revenue stream the states considered theirs. And here's maybe the most delicious irony in this entire story. The highway lobby, the very industries and advocacy groups that had spent decades fighting to establish gasoline taxation as a fair, dedicated user fee for roads, actually opposed the new federal gas tax when it was proposed. Their argument was straightforward and principled. If you're going to tax a specific group of people, motorists, for using a specific product, gasoline, then basic fairness demands that the money raised should go toward the thing those people are actually using, the roads, not simply vanish into the government's general fund to plug an unrelated budget hole. Congress didn't listen to that argument, at least not yet. The 1932 federal gas tax revenue flowed straight into general treasury coffers, entirely disconnected from federal highway spending. and it stayed that way for years, surviving Hoover's departure and persisting right through Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and into the Second World War, becoming permanent at a rate of 1.5 cents in 1941, still functioning primarily as ordinary general revenue rather than a dedicated highway fund. It would actually take until the middle of the 20th century, specifically the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, the same legislation that created the interstate highway system before federal gasoline tax revenue was formally and permanently linked to a dedicated pool of money called the Highway Trust Fund, exclusively reserved for building and maintaining roads. Which means, if you really want to appreciate the full absurdity here, the user pays for the roads they use principle that most of us now assume has always defined American road funding didn't actually become the settled federal policy until 1956, nearly 4 decades after the automobile had already utterly transformed American life, and a full 24 years after the federal gas tax itself had first appeared for a completely unrelated purpose. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to add one more layer to this story, because it involves a genuinely uncomfortable chapter that most casual histories of American roads skip over entirely, and leaving it out would give you an incomplete and overly tidy picture. Not all of the labor that built early 20th century American roads was free in either sense of that word. In numerous states, particularly across the South, road construction and maintenance during this era leaned heavily on convict labor, prisoners, disproportionately black men swept up under discriminatory laws and sentencing practices, forced to work on chain gangs, building the very highways that free citizens would soon be driving their new automobiles across. This wasn't a hidden footnote at the time. It was a widely used and openly discussed method of road construction. And it's telling that when the federal government significantly expanded road building programs during the Depression as an employment relief measure, Congress explicitly moved to prohibit the use of convict labor on federal aid highway projects, a legislative acknowledgement, decades after the fact, that something about the practice had been fundamentally wrong. When we talk about how America paid for its roads, the full accounting has to include this human cost alongside the property taxes, the tolls, and the pennies collected at the gas pump. So let's step back and pull this entire story together, because I think it genuinely changes how you should think about that little tax embedded in the price of every gallon of gasoline you buy today. The truth is, there has never really been one single coherent, philosophically consistent system for funding American roads. What actually happened was a messy, improvised, century-and-a-half-long relay race between wildly different funding mechanisms, each one emerging not from some grand unified plan, but as a desperate patch for the failures of whatever system came before it. Statute labor gave way to private turnpike tolls when communities proved incapable of maintaining roads through unpaid labor alone. Turnpikes collapsed under railroad competition and reverted back to underfunded local government control. A coalition of wealthy cyclists and struggling farmers built the first real national political pressure for reform, decades before automobiles even existed in meaningful numbers. The federal government finally stepped in, but only by carefully disguising highway funding as postal road funding to avoid a constitutional fight. States independently invented the gas tax as an elegant user fee solution, and it spread almost virally within a single decade. And when the federal government finally added its own gas tax, it wasn't remotely about roads at all. It was a Depression-era financial emergency measure that took another 24 years to actually connect to the very roads it taxed the fuel for. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this messiness, and it's one that applies well beyond just the history of asphalt and pennies per gallon. We tend to assume that the systems we live inside today, the ones that feel so obvious and permanent that we never even think to question them, must have been carefully designed that way from the start. A gas tax funds roads, obviously, because what else would it be for? But almost none of these systems were actually designed with that kind of clean foresight. They accumulated piece by piece, compromise by compromise, crisis by crisis, shaped as much by bicycle lobbyists and Depression-era desperation and constitutional workarounds as by any coherent long-term vision. The obvious way things work is very often just whatever awkward accidental arrangement happened to survive long enough to start feeling permanent. And this history isn't just a historical curiosity. It's directly relevant to a genuine crisis happening in American infrastructure right now. The federal gas tax has been frozen at the same rate since 1993, not adjusted even once for inflation in over 3 decades, even as cars have become dramatically more fuel efficient and now, increasingly, run on no gasoline at all. The fundamental user pays model that finally got established in 1956 is quietly breaking down again. For essentially the same reason the old statute, labor, and turnpike systems eventually broke down. The world kept changing and the funding mechanism didn't keep up. Which means, in all likelihood, we are once again somewhere in the middle of one of these messy, multi-decade transitions, probably towards some new system nobody has fully settled on yet, mileage-based fees, tolling, something else entirely, that a few decades from now will feel just as permanent and obvious as the gas tax does today. History doesn't usually announce when it's repeating itself. It just quietly does. So the next time you're standing at a gas pump and you notice that tax tucked into the price per gallon, remember what's actually buried underneath it. Remember the farmers sweating out their taxes with a shovel on a muddy country lane. Remember the toll gates on the road out of Philadelphia. Remember the wealthy cyclists in Newport, Rhode Island, who started a political movement that would eventually pave a continent. And remember that when the federal government finally did create a gasoline tax, it had absolutely nothing to do with roads at all. It was just a nation in the depths of its worst economic catastrophe, looking for pennies wherever it could find them. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And it's what lets me keep digging into the hidden histories behind the things we take for granted every single day. And if you've got your own thoughts on how America should fund its roads going forward, I'd love to hear them in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.